The morning sun cut through the Hindu Kush mountains like a blade through old bone, painting the canyon walls in shades of copper and shadow. Captain Meredith Calloway pushed her A-10 Thunderbolt II into a descent that made her instrument panels scream warnings she'd learned to ignore years ago. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 500 feet, 400, 300. Below her, the canyon waited with walls of ancient rock that had witnessed empires rise and crumble to dust. Any station, this is Bravo 6 Actual. The voice crackling through her headset carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from 18 hours of continuous combat. We have 12 souls on the ground. Heavy contact, danger close. We need immediate air support or we're going to lose everyone. Meredith's gloved hand tightened on the stick. 12 Navy SEALs, 18 hours pinned down in a valley so narrow that every pilot who'd attempted support runs had been forced to abort. The terrain made it a death trap, steep canyon walls rising 2,000 feet on either side, with enemy fighters positioned on the high ground like wolves surrounding wounded prey. The mission commanders had already declared the situation unsalvageable. Extraction wasn't possible. Air support wasn't feasible. Those 12 men were ghosts already, alive only in the terrible present tense, waiting for grammar to catch up with reality. That's when Meredith keyed her radio with 4 words that would echo through the halls of Kandahar Air Base for days to come. Reaper 21 inbound. The air traffic controller's response was immediate and sharp. Negative, Reaper 21. Area is declared no fly. Terrain advisory in effect. Minimum safe altitude is 1,500 feet. You are currently at 200 and dropping. Meredith's voice carried no bravado, no theatrical courage, just the flat certainty of a woman who'd done the mathematics of death and found the equation wanting. Bravo 6 Actual, mark your position with IR strobes. Everyone down in hard cover. I'm coming through the front door. The canyon entrance rushed toward her like the throat of some ancient god. 58 feet wide at its narrowest point. Her A-10's wingspan measured 30 feet from tip to tip, leaving 14 feet of clearance on each side. 7 feet per wing, 84 inches, less space than a parking spot at a suburban grocery store. Meredith dropped to 100 feet above the valley floor. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines growled like caged thunder behind her, their sound bouncing off the rock walls in overlapping echoes that made it seem like a squadron was flying instead of a single aircraft. The titanium bathtub cockpit wrapped around her like armor forged specifically for this moment, for this impossible choice between physics and will. 75 feet. The canyon walls blurred past her wingtips. She could see the striations in the ancient stone, layers of geological time compressed into bands of color that testified to epochs before humans learned to make fire, let alone fly. The rock was close enough that she could count the individual boulders, see the scraggly vegetation clinging to impossible cracks, witness the absolute indifference of geology to the tiny concerns of warfare. 50 feet, her targeting system painted the enemy positions in cold, digital certainty. Taliban fighters lined the eastern ridge, their weapons creating a lattice of overlapping fire that had kept the SEALs pinned for 18 hours. They'd chosen their ground well, using terrain that conventional doctrine declared untouchable. They'd learned from decades of fighting technologically superior forces. You can't beat American aircraft in open ground, but you can make the ground so constrained that American aircraft can't reach you. They hadn't counted on Meredith Calloway. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spun up with a sound like industrial machinery preparing to tear reality apart. 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, each 30mm shell the size of a beer bottle, made of depleted uranium dense enough to punch through tank armor. The cannon's recoil was so powerful that the A-10 had been designed around it, the aircraft essentially a flying gun with wings and engines added as afterthoughts. The distinctive bird sound erupted, and the canyon transformed into something beyond warfare, beyond combat, into a space where physics itself seemed negotiable. The sound didn't just fill the valley, it became the valley, echoing off walls and layering upon itself until it seemed like the mountains themselves were roaring their ancient fury. 30-millimeter rounds chewed through the enemy positions with surgical precision. Bodies disappeared. Weapons shattered. Rock exploded into fragments that ricocheted like secondary shrapnel. The Taliban fighters who'd held the high ground for 18 hours suddenly found themselves in a hell they couldn't understand, attacked by an aircraft that shouldn't exist in their carefully prepared kill zone. Meredith pulled into a climb that compressed her into the seat with forces that made her vision narrow to a tunnel. The G-suit squeezed her legs and abdomen, forcing blood back toward her brain, but the edges of her sight still went gray. She ignored it, focused instead on the turn, the bank, the return approach that would bring her back into the canyon for a second pass. Reaper 21, you're taking fire from multiple positions. The ground controller's voice carried notes of disbelief and professional concern in equal measure. Advise you pull back and reassess. Negative. Bravo 6, I'm making another pass. Western Ridge this time. Keep your heads down. The second run was tighter. The canyon narrowed as it progressed deeper into the mountains, and Meredith found herself flying through airspace that measured 48 feet wide, 24 feet to either side. Her wingtips clearing the rock walls by margins measured in feet, then inches. The proximity warning system in her cockpit had given up trying to alert her to terrain. The synthetic voice had cycled through its programmed warnings and now simply emitted a continuous tone that Meredith had learned to interpret like a musician reading sheet music. High pitch meant closer to the left wall. Lower pitch meant right wall proximity. The constant middle tone meant she was threading the needle perfectly, balanced in a space that shouldn't accommodate metal and thrust and human ambition. AGM-65 Maverick missiles launched from her wing pylons with chunks of compressed violence, their rocket motors leaving contrails in the mountain air. Laser-guided, each one tracked to enemy positions that the SEALs below had marked with designators, painting targets in invisible light that only the missiles could see. The explosions rippled along the western ridge like a string of firecrackers made from military-grade fury. On her third pass, something changed. Meredith felt it before she understood it. A vibration in the stick that wasn't turbulence, wasn't engine response, wasn't any of the 1,000 familiar sensations that become instinct after 600 hours in the same aircraft type. This was new. This was wrong. Her starboard wing had made contact, not with enemy fire, not with a bird strike or foreign object damage, with the canyon wall itself. Vegetation scraped along the wing edge with a sound like fingernails on sheet metal. Rock kissed aluminum alloy at 300 knots, creating friction that would have torn apart lesser aircraft. The A-10, built to absorb punishment that would destroy any other close air support platform, shuddered but held together. Meredith compensated without conscious thought, her hands and feet working controls and combinations that no training manual covered because no training manual anticipated flying this close to terrain. She was operating in a space between doctrine and disaster, where only instinct and skill separated one from the other. The fourth pass took her even lower, 40 feet above the valley floor. The dust kicked up by her jet wash created a temporary fog that obscured vision, forcing her to fly by instrument and faith in equal measure. The GAU-8 fired again, its rounds walking across enemy positions with mechanical precision, each burst calculated to destroy without touching the friendly forces huddled behind whatever cover they could find. And then it was done. The canyon opened up ahead, widening into a valley that allowed Meredith to climb without the walls constraining her ascent. She pulled back on the stick, and the A-10 responded like a beast released from captivity, clawing for altitude with engines that had been built to take punishment and keep delivering violence. Bravo 6 actual, this is Reaper 21. Enemy position suppressed. You should have a window for extraction. The response came after a pause, long enough that Meredith wondered if they'd been hit after all. If her impossible flying had been for nothing but a few extra minutes before the inevitable. Reaper 21, Bravo 6 actual. The voice was different now, stripped of exhaustion and filled with something Meredith couldn't quite name. We thought, all 12 of us are going home because of you. I don't have words. You don't need words, Bravo 6. Just get your people out of there. Meredith turned her aircraft toward Kandahar, the adrenaline beginning to leak out of her system and leave behind the hollow feeling that always followed combat. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was measured. But somewhere deep in her chest, something trembled with the recognition of what she'd just done, what she'd just survived, what she'd just proven about the malleable nature of impossible. The flight back to base passed in a blur of radio checks and fuel calculations. Meredith went through the motions with mechanical precision, her mind already beginning to compartmentalize the mission, to file it away in whatever mental space pilots use to store memories of the moments when they should have died, but didn't. Landing was routine. Taxi was routine. Shutdown checklist was routine. Everything was routine except the way the ground crew looked at her aircraft when she climbed out of the cockpit. They stood at a distance, not with fear, but with something like reverence, their eyes tracking along the fuselage and wings with professional assessment. Airman First Class Rebecca Donovan approached with a tablet in hand and an expression that Meredith had learned to recognize over 6 years of watching Beck maintain A-10s. It was the look of someone who'd found something they didn't want to believe. Ma'am, I need to conduct post-flight inspection before you debrief. Of course, Beck. Is there a problem? Beck's eyes flicked to the starboard wing, then back to Meredith. That's what I need to determine, ma'am. The briefing wouldn't happen for another 72 hours. Meredith had time to shower, to eat, to sleep in fitful bursts interrupted by dreams of canyon walls that moved closer with each pass. She had time to write the after-action report in the dry, clinical language that the Air Force preferred, reducing impossible to a series of grid coordinates and munitions expended. She had time to wonder if what she'd done was skill or luck, courage or recklessness, heroism or the kind of calculated insanity that wins medals and costs careers in equal measure. But she didn't have time to prepare for the silence that fell when she walked into the briefing room 3 days later. The room was packed. Not just her squadron, but pilots from other units, ground controllers, intelligence officers, even a few personnel she didn't recognize from their uniforms. They all turned when she entered, and the conversations died like candles in a sudden wind. Meredith took her customary seat in the front row, her flight suit crisp, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun. The only indication of stress, a barely visible tremor in her left hand that appeared only when she was completely still. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room with the bearing of a man who'd spent 25 years in military aviation and thought he'd seen everything. His weathered face showed the kind of respect earned through experience and altitude, but his eyes held something else. A mixture of awe and concern that Meredith had seen before in the faces of people trying to reconcile the possible with the actual. Ladies and gentlemen, Webb's voice carried the weight of authority earned through countless briefings in countless rooms just like this one. What Captain Calloway accomplished 3 days ago in the Hindu Kush shouldn't have been possible. According to every tactical manual, every safety protocol, and every piece of conventional wisdom we've accumulated over decades of close air support operations, that canyon run was a death sentence. He activated the wall-mounted display. Satellite imagery of the Hindu Kush filled the screen, showing the canyon where 12 American warriors had faced certain death. The image was clinical, sterile, giving no sense of the violence that had filled that space or the impossible flying required to change the outcome. The minimum safe altitude for that terrain is 1,500 feet. Webb advanced to the next slide, showing Meredith's flight path traced in red against the canyon topography. Captain Calloway's telemetry data shows she maintained an average altitude of 75 feet throughout the engagement. A murmur ran through the assembled personnel. 75 feet. The number was one thing in a report, another thing entirely when visualized against the terrain. The angle of attack required to maintain controlled flight at that altitude while simultaneously engaging targets on elevated terrain should have resulted in immediate terrain impact. Webb's voice remained professionally neutral, but Meredith could hear the subtext beneath the words. Yet somehow, Captain Calloway not only survived the run, but achieved a 98% target destruction rate while operating in what we now officially classify as a no-fly zone. Lieutenant Wyatt Hollis raised his hand. 26 years old, top of his class from pilot training, 850 flight hours logged with the precision of someone who believed hours translated directly to capability. He carried himself with a swagger of youth that hadn't yet been tempered by the recognition of mortality. "Sir, with all due respect," Hollis's voice carried the kind of skepticism that comes from book learning without battlefield experience. "The flight data doesn't match standard performance parameters for the A-10 at those altitudes. The aircraft shouldn't have been able to maintain controlled flight, especially while engaging targets. Are we certain that telemetry is accurate?" The room fell silent. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Either the data was wrong, or Captain Calloway had somehow fabricated her success. The young lieutenant's face flushed red as he realized the weight of his accusation, but he pressed forward with the arrogance of someone who'd never had to choose between impossible and death. "I mean, the physics just don't add up. No pilot, regardless of skill level, should have been able to pull off that kind of precision flying in those conditions." Meredith turned slowly in her chair to face Hollis. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying the authority of someone who'd proven herself in the crucible of combat. "Lieutenant, have you ever flown close air support in mountainous terrain?" Hollis's Adam's apple bobbed. "No, ma'am, but I've logged over 800 hours in the A-10, and I understand the aircraft's limitations." Understanding limitations and pushing beyond them are two different things. Meredith's tone held neither condescension nor defensiveness. The physics work fine when you stop thinking like a textbook and start thinking like a pilot who refuses to let American warriors die because something seems impossible. Before Hollis could respond, a voice cut through from the back of the room. Master Sergeant Diane Harding had been standing quietly, observing with the kind of attention that came from 22 years of coordinating air support missions from the ground. When she spoke, the room listened. "I was the ground controller for that mission." Harding's voice had the quality of hammered steel, shaped by experience into something that could bear weight without bending. "I was the one talking to Bravo 6 Actual when they made their final transmission before Captain Calloway's arrival. The SEAL team leader's exact words were, 'Tell our families we went down fighting.' They had given up hope." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting everyone in the room imagine being on the receiving end of that transmission, being the person who had to accept that 12 Americans were going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Standard doctrine had failed them. Standard procedures had failed them. Standard thinking had condemned 12 American warriors to death in a canyon that everyone declared impossible to support. Captain Calloway didn't just save those SEALs. She redefined what's possible in close air support operations. And instead of celebrating that achievement, we're sitting here questioning whether it really happened. Harding's eyes swept the room, making contact with every pilot present. "I've been coordinating air support missions since before some of you learned to drive. I know the difference between skill and luck. What Captain Calloway did in that canyon was pure skill, backed by more courage than I've seen in 2 decades of combat operations." Lieutenant Hollis looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. He challenged not just Meredith's abilities, but by extension, the credibility of the entire mission record. In military culture, questioning the integrity of a successful combat mission was tantamount to accusing everyone involved of either incompetence or dishonesty. Colonel Webb sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere and moved to redirect the briefing toward more productive territory. Master Sergeant Harding raises an important point. This mission succeeded because Captain Calloway was willing to operate outside conventional parameters. The question we need to answer is whether we can develop training protocols that prepare other pilots for similar situations. But the briefing was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young airman entered, moved to Colonel Webb, and whispered something that made the wing commander's eyebrows rise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're joined by a special consultant from JSOC." Webb gestured to the door. "Please welcome Colonel Garrett Brennan." The man who entered looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the Hindu Kush itself. 72 years old with steel-gray eyes that had witnessed decades of military aviation. His uniform was crisp, but carried ribbons from conflicts that half the room had only read about in history books. The Cold War. Operations so classified they still wore heavy redaction in official records. Missions that predated precision munitions and GPS, flown with instruments that belonged in museums, and courage that belonged in legends. Colonel Garrett Brennan moved to the front of the room with the economy of motion that came from a lifetime of discipline. He didn't smile. He didn't offer pleasantries. He simply looked at the tactical display showing Meredith's flight path through the canyon, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. "I was sent by JSOC to assess this mission." Garrett's eyes found Meredith in the front row. "Because 26 years ago, I flew a mission in the same Hindu Kush Canyon, and I lost my wingman there." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. The canyon dimensions haven't changed. The terrain hasn't gotten easier. The physics of flight remain constant. What Captain Calloway accomplished 3 days ago is exactly as impossible as it was in 1998, and exactly as necessary. Garrett turned to face Lieutenant Hollis directly. "Lieutenant, I flew 247 combat missions across 4 decades. 89 of them were classified as impossible before I flew them. The only difference between impossible and inevitable is the pilot's will. Captain Calloway has that will." He pulled a photograph from his pocket and placed it on the display screen. The image showed a younger Garrett standing next to another pilot in front of an F-16. Both men wore flight suits marked with squadron patches from an era before digital cameras made every moment instantly shareable. "This is Captain Elias Calloway, 1998, Tora Bora region, Afghanistan. My wingman. He died in a canyon 46 feet wide, trying to save Rangers who'd been pinned down by enemy fire. His aircraft took an RPG hit. Hydraulics failed. He had time to eject. He chose to complete the attack run instead. Saved 15 Rangers. Didn't save himself." Garrett's eyes locked on Meredith, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Captain Meredith Calloway." Garrett's voice softened slightly. "I need to speak with you after this briefing. Privately." The rest of the briefing passed in a blur. Meredith heard words about tactical assessments and performance parameters and training modifications, but they washed over her without landing. All she could see was that photograph. The man in the flight suit standing next to Garrett Brennan. The face she'd only seen in a handful of pictures her mother had kept in a box, marked with her father's name. When the briefing finally concluded, Meredith remained in her seat as the room emptied. Garrett waited until they were alone, then pulled up a chair and sat facing her with the directness of someone who'd spent too many years delivering bad news to waste time on gentle approaches. "You didn't know I flew with your father." It wasn't a question. Meredith shook her head. "Your mother and I lost touch after the funeral. Military life, different bases, time." Garrett's hands rested on his knees, steady despite his age. "I've been following your career. When I saw your name assigned to Kandahar, I knew eventually you'd face a situation like this. A canyon, an impossible mission, a choice between doctrine and lives. Did you try to stop him?" Meredith's voice came out smaller than she intended. "My father, in that canyon, Did you tell him not to go? I ordered him not to go. Garrett's eyes held old pain, the kind that time doesn't heal so much as teach you to carry. I was senior officer. I had authority. I told him to abort, let the Rangers hold out until we could get conventional support. He disobeyed a direct order and saved 15 men and left behind a 2-year-old daughter who grew up without a father. Garrett leaned forward. Captain Calloway, JSOC has another mission. Tora Bora region. 8 Delta Force operators trapped in a valley that makes Hindu Kush look spacious. They specifically requested you by name. Meredith's breath caught. Tora Bora, where my father died, yes. The same canyon system. Different valley, but the same impossible terrain. 46 feet wide at the narrowest point. Your A-10's wingspan is 30 feet. That gives you 8 feet on either side, 4 feet per wing. Garrett's voice remained clinical, but his eyes showed something else. JSOC wants to know if you can do it again, if Hindu Kush was skill or luck, if you're the pilot who can operate in terrain that killed your father. And what do you want to know? I want to know if you're willing to die to prove you're as good as Elias Calloway was. Garrett stood, moved to the window overlooking the flight line. Because that's what this mission is asking. That's what impossible always asks. And I need to know if you understand the difference between being your father's daughter and being your father. Meredith felt anger flash through her, hot and sudden. You think I have a death wish? I think you've spent 26 years living in the shadow of a hero you never knew. I think you joined the Air Force to understand the man who left you. I think you fly like you're trying to prove something to a ghost. Garrett turned back to face her. And I think that's going to get you killed unless someone who loved your father helps you understand what he'd actually want for you. You don't know what he'd want. Yes, I do. Garrett's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Because before he died, he told me. The words hung between them like ordnance waiting to detonate. Meredith stared at Garrett Brennan, this man who'd emerged from classified operations and decades-old photographs to claim knowledge of her father's final thoughts. The briefing room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of 26 years of questions she'd learned to stop asking because no one had answers. What did he say? Her voice came out steady, despite the trembling that had started somewhere deep in her chest. Garrett moved back to his chair, sat down with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed too many years of high-G maneuvers and hard landings. When he spoke, his eyes focused on something beyond the room, beyond the present, into a past that clearly still had teeth. We need to discuss the Tora Bora mission first. Then I'll tell you everything your father said, in order, the way it happened. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, placed it on the table between them. JSOC wants an answer within 24 hours. 8 Delta Force operators. 6-hour window before enemy overruns their position. The terrain is worse than Hindu Kush, and I'm assigned as your tactical advisor. I don't need an advisor. No, you need someone who's already died in that canyon and came back. Garrett opened the folder, revealing satellite imagery that made the Hindu Kush look generous by comparison. I know where your father made his mistakes because I watched him make them. I know where the wind shear pockets hide. I know which shadows indicate thermal updrafts that'll flip you inverted if you're not prepared. I know that canyon like I know my own hands, and I'm not letting Elias Calloway's daughter fly it blind. Meredith looked at the imagery. The valley was a scar cut into the mountains by geological violence that predated human concerns. 46 feet wide, walls that rose 3,000 feet on either side, approach vectors that required threading between peaks that could hide enemy positions with perfect fields of fire. Why are you really here? She met Garrett's eyes directly. JSOC has dozens of tactical advisors. Why you? Why now? Because when I saw your name on the pilot roster for Hindu Kush, I volunteered. When I saw the after-action report, I knew you'd be tapped for Tora Bora. And I made a promise to your father 26 years ago that I'd find you if you ever became a pilot, that I'd make sure you didn't repeat his mistakes. What mistakes? He saved 15 Rangers. He saved 15 Rangers and orphaned his daughter. That's not heroism. That's math with a tragic remainder. Garrett's voice hardened. Your father was the best pilot I ever flew with. Better than me, better than anyone in our squadron. He could make an F-16 do things that violated the manual. But he was also proud and stubborn and so focused on proving himself that he forgot the people waiting for him to come home. Meredith felt something sharp twist in her chest. You're saying he was reckless. I'm saying he was 28 years old and trying to live up to a legacy that didn't exist yet, trying to be the hero in a story that hadn't been written. And it killed him. Garrett leaned forward. You flew Hindu Kush like you were trying to prove something, like you were racing against a ghost. That works once, maybe twice if you're lucky. But luck runs out, Captain. Skill keeps you alive. And the difference between skill and suicide is knowing when to say no. The anger that flashed through Meredith was clean and hot. I saved 12 SEALs. You did. And now 8 Delta operators need saving in terrain that's narrower, more constrained, with enemy positions that have been fortified since your father's death. If you fly Tora Bora the way you flew Hindu Kush, you won't come back. And I'll have to write another letter to another family explaining why another Calloway thought impossible was just another word for inevitable. Meredith stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I didn't ask for a babysitter. No, you asked to be the pilot who does impossible missions. JSOC is giving you that chance. I'm just making sure you survive it long enough to do more than one. Garrett remained seated, calm in the face of her anger. Go back to your quarters. Think about it. We brief at 0600 tomorrow. And Captain, bring questions about your father. I owe you 26 years of answers. Meredith left the briefing room without another word, her boots echoing in the empty corridor. The anger carried her halfway across the base before it started to leak away, replaced by something more complicated. Confusion, resentment, and underneath it all, a desperate curiosity about the father she'd constructed from photographs and other people's stories. Her quarters were standard officer accommodation, a bed, a desk, a locker, a window that looked out over the flight line where A-10s sat in neat rows like sleeping predators. Meredith pulled out the single photograph she carried, the one her mother had given her before she left for the Air Force Academy. Captain Elias Calloway, in flight suit, standing in front of an F-16, his smile the kind that suggested he knew something the camera didn't. Meredith had studied this photograph for years, looking for clues about the man behind the uniform, the father behind the hero. She'd found nothing except her own reflection in the resemblance. Same jawline, same eyes, same expression that people called determined, but might also be called stubborn. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams of canyons that narrowed with each pass until there was no way forward and no way back. The knock on her door came at 0530, 30 minutes before the scheduled briefing. Meredith opened it to find Airman Rebecca Donovan holding a tablet and wearing an expression that mixed professional concern with something close to fear. Ma'am, I need to show you something about your aircraft from the Hindu Kush mission. They walked to the maintenance hangar in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. The A-10 sat under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by maintenance equipment and diagnostic tools. Beck led Meredith to the starboard wing and pointed. Paint scraped away in long streaks, metal scoring that caught the light, vegetation embedded in seams where aluminum panels met. The damage ran for nearly 6 feet along the wing's leading edge, telling a story that made Beck's next words almost redundant. Ma'am, this isn't enemy fire. This is terrain contact. You scraped the canyon wall. Beck pulled up images on her tablet showing the damage from multiple angles. I've been maintaining A-10s for 6 years. I've seen battle damage from small arms, RPGs, AAA, even ASAM proximity burst once. I've never seen this. Meredith ran her hand along the damaged section, feeling the roughness where stone had kissed metal at 300 knots. The contact had been so brief, so controlled, that she'd barely registered it during the mission. But here in the unforgiving light of the maintenance hangar, the evidence was undeniable. The belly armor shows similar patterns. Beck scrolled through more images. Rock contact in 3 separate locations. Ma'am, according to the stress analysis, your aircraft experienced forces outside design parameters. You should have lost control. The wing should have deformed enough to make the aircraft unflyable. But it didn't. No, ma'am, because A-10s are built to take punishment and keep flying. But ma'am, Beck lowered her voice, my brother serves with the 75th Rangers. He heard about your mission through military channels. The Ranger community is calling you the Ghost Rider. They're saying you flew through solid rock. Meredith looked at her aircraft with new understanding. She'd known the mission was dangerous. She'd felt the proximity to terrain. But seeing the physical evidence, understanding how close she'd come to catastrophic failure, added weight to what Garrett had said about luck running out. Beck, can this aircraft fly another mission? Ma'am, I can repair the damage, but I'd like to make some modifications first. Based on what I learned from this mission, Beck's voice carried the careful tone of someone about to suggest something that bent regulations. Enhanced control surface responsiveness, improved throttle sensitivity, and I want to install proximity sensors that'll give you auditory warnings when you're within 5 feet of solid objects. That's not standard equipment. No, ma'am, but neither is flying through canyons that are narrower than your wingspan. Beck met Meredith's eyes directly. Ma'am, I heard Colonel Brennan is advising on your next mission. I looked him up. He's a legend. Cold War operations that are still classified. If he's worried enough to come out of retirement, then I'm worried enough to modify your aircraft without waiting for official approval. That could end your career if something goes wrong. Yes, ma'am, but I'd rather face a court-martial than explain to 8 families why I followed regulations instead of doing everything possible to bring you home. Beck's voice was steady. My brother is alive because Rangers like him have pilots like you. I'm not letting bureaucracy kill you when I can do something about it. Meredith felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of the invisible web that connected every person in military service. Beck wasn't just maintaining aircraft. She was personally invested in mission success in ways that transcended duty rosters and job descriptions. How long for the modifications? 18 hours if I work through the night. I'll have her ready by tomorrow evening. Beck paused. Ma'am, Colonel Brennan requested access to the maintenance hangar. He wants to inspect your aircraft personally. I told him 0700. He's thorough. He's scared, ma'am. I can see it in his eyes. He's seen pilots die in those mountains, and he's terrified you're going to be next. The briefing at 0600 was smaller than the previous one. Just Meredith, Garrett, Colonel Webb, Master Sergeant Harding, and 2 JSOC representatives whose faces had the careful blankness that came from careers spent in classified operations. The conference room felt larger with fewer people, the empty chairs suggesting all the pilots who wouldn't be flying this mission. Garrett stood at the front, looking like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. Meredith recognized the signs from her own mirror. Eyes that had stared at ceiling tiles for hours. Hands that moved with excess energy that came from too much coffee and too little rest. Tora Bora Valley, coordinates classified. Garrett activated the display showing terrain that looked like God had taken a knife to the mountains. 8 Delta Force operators inserted 72 hours ago for a high-value target elimination. Mission successful. Extraction helicopter shot down during exfil. All 8 operators survived the crash and are currently in defensive positions around the wreckage. The satellite imagery updated to show the crash site, a black scar in a valley that measured 46 feet wide at its broadest point, narrowing to 42 feet at the insertion point where the operators waited. Enemy forces, estimated 50 to 60 Taliban fighters, converging from multiple directions. Intelligence indicates they're using the same tactics that proved effective in the 1990s, creating overlapping fields of fire from elevated positions, using the terrain to channel any air support into a kill zone. Garrett's voice remained professionally neutral, but Meredith could hear the subtext. This was the same tactical situation that had killed her father. The ground team has approximately 6 hours before enemy forces reach their position. After that, they will be overrun. Extraction is impossible via helicopter due to the terrain and enemy air defense systems. Our only option is close air support to suppress enemy positions long enough for a ground extraction team to reach them. Colonel Webb spoke up. What's the timeline for ground extraction? 15 minutes from when the air corridor is clear, but maintaining that corridor requires continuous air presence in the valley, and the valley dimensions make conventional support impossible. Garrett pulled up comparative imagery showing Hindu Kush alongside Tora Bora. Captain Calloway flew through a 58-foot canyon at Hindu Kush. Tora Bora's widest point is 46 feet. The narrowest is 42. Lieutenant Wyatt Hollis had been invited to observe, and he spoke with noticeably more humility than in the previous briefing. Sir, that leaves 6 feet of clearance on either side for a 30-foot wingspan. Is that even theoretically possible? It's been done once before. Garrett's eyes found Meredith. 1998, Captain Elias Calloway threaded that exact canyon in an F-16 with a 31-foot wingspan. He had 5.5 feet of clearance on either side. He made 3 successful attack runs. On the 4th, his aircraft took an RPG hit that severed hydraulic lines. He completed the attack run with no hydraulics and crashed on egress. The room was silent. The Rangers he saved recovered his body from the wreckage. He'd stayed conscious long enough to aim the aircraft away from friendly positions before impact. His last radio transmission was, Garrett's voice caught slightly, the first crack in his professional demeanor. His last transmission was instructions for me to find his daughter and tell her something. Meredith felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The connection hadn't been public knowledge until this moment. Now it hung in the air like revelation and complication in equal measure. What was the message? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After the briefing, privately, as promised. Garrett turned back to the tactical display. Captain Calloway, JSOC is requesting you for this mission, specifically. But I'm advising them that you shouldn't fly it alone. I'm proposing a 2-aircraft approach. You in the primary attack aircraft, me flying chase in a second A-10, providing high cover and additional firepower from altitude. Webb frowned. Colonel Brennan, with all respect, you're 72 years old and have been retired for 14 years. Yes, but I've been maintaining my flight status through contractor work. I'm current and qualified in the A-10. I've flown that specific canyon 3 times. And I'm not asking permission, Colonel. I'm informing you that JSOC has already approved my participation. Garrett's tone made clear this wasn't negotiable. Captain Calloway will fly lead. I'll provide tactical guidance and secondary support. If she gets into trouble, I have the experience to extract her. Meredith felt anger flash hot. I don't need extraction. I need to do my job. Your job is to bring those operators home and survive to fly another mission. My job is to make sure you understand those aren't mutually exclusive objectives. Garrett's eyes locked with hers. Your father thought he had to choose between mission success and survival. He was wrong. I'm going to make sure you don't make the same mistake. The JSOC representatives exchanged glances. Then the senior one spoke. Captain Calloway, we need your answer. Will you accept this mission with Colonel Brennan as your tactical advisor and chase pilot? Meredith looked at the tactical display, at the canyon that had killed her father, at the 8 Delta operators whose lives depended on someone willing to fly through terrain that shouldn't accommodate aircraft. She looked at Garrett Brennan, this man who claimed to carry her father's final words, who was willing to climb back into a cockpit at 72 to keep her alive. I'll accept on one condition. She turned to Garrett. You tell me what my father said. Now, before I commit to this mission, I need to know. Garrett looked at Colonel Webb, who nodded and gestured for everyone else to leave. The room emptied until only Meredith and Garrett remained, the tactical display still showing the canyon where Elias Calloway had died 26 years ago. Garrett sat down heavily, as if the weight of decades was suddenly too much to bear standing. When he spoke, his voice carried the texture of memory that had been examined too many times, polished smooth by repetition, but never losing its ability to cut. Your father knew he was dying. The aircraft was on fire, hydraulics were gone. He had maybe 90 seconds before impact. But he was calm, focused, like he'd already accepted what was coming and was just trying to finish the work. Garrett's hands gripped the edge of the table. I was screaming at him to eject. He keyed his radio one last time and said, Garrett, my baby girl is 2 years old. Find her when she's grown. If she becomes a pilot, tell her I loved her. Tell her I'm proud of her. And tell her to fly smarter than her old man. The words hit Meredith like physical force. She'd spent 26 years imagining her father's final moments, constructing narratives of heroism and sacrifice. She'd never imagined him thinking of her, giving instructions for a future where she existed, and he didn't. Fly smarter than her old man. Garrett's voice was soft now, almost gentle. Not braver, not more aggressively, smarter, because your father knew, at the end, that he'd been too focused on proving himself, too willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. He wanted better for you. Meredith felt tears threatening and forced them back through pure will. He saved 15 Rangers. He did, and he paid for it with everything he had. But the point isn't that he was wrong to save them. The point is that he could have saved them and survived if he'd been willing to fly differently. If he'd been willing to ask for help. If he'd been willing to say, I can't do this alone, instead of treating every mission like a test of personal capability. You think I'm like him. I know you're like him. You flew Hindu Kush solo when you could have requested support. You pushed into terrain that was tactically unsound because 12 SEALs needed saving, and you wouldn't let impossible stop you. That's your father's courage, but it's also his blind spot. Garrett leaned forward. I'm not here to clip your wings, Captain. I'm here to make sure you live long enough to become the pilot your father wanted you to be. The one who's smart enough to know when to say yes and when to say no. When to fly solo and when to accept help. Meredith looked at the tactical display, at the canyon where her father had made his last choice. She thought about Beck's modifications, about the damage to her aircraft from Hindu Kush, about the razor-thin margins between success and catastrophe. If I accept your help, I'm still pilot in command. My mission, my call. Agreed. I'm chase aircraft and advisor, your lead. But if you're about to do something that'll kill you, I'm going to tell you. And I expect you to listen. And if I don't, then I'll have to live with another Calloway dying in those mountains while I watch helplessly. But at least I'll know I tried. Garrett stood, moved toward the door, then paused. Your father's last words weren't, complete the mission or save the Rangers. They were about you, about wanting you to have a future. Don't waste that by trying to prove you're as brave as he was. Prove you're smarter. He left Meredith alone with the tactical display and the weight of 26 years of imagined conversations with a father she'd never known. She stared at the canyon imagery until the lines blurred, until she couldn't tell if she was looking at terrain or at the shape of her own history. Finally, she pulled out her phone and dialed Colonel Webb. Sir, Captain Calloway, I'm accepting the mission. With Colonel Brennan as chase pilot, wheels up in 24 hours. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of mission planning and preparation. Beck worked through the night on aircraft modifications, while Meredith and Garrett pored over tactical approaches, weather patterns, and enemy position assessments. They worked in professional silence, broken by brief exchanges about approach angles and weapons loads, each focused on the mechanics of survival. At 0300, Beck found them still in the planning room and announced the aircraft were ready. Meredith followed her to the maintenance hangar, where both A-10s sat under lights that made them look like museum pieces rather than weapons of war. "The modifications are installed in your aircraft, ma'am." Beck walked Meredith through the enhanced control systems, the proximity sensors that would emit tones when she approached terrain, the improved throttle response that would give her finer control in tight maneuvering. "I've also reinforced the belly armor in the areas that showed impact damage from Hindu Kush, and I installed a terrain-following radar system that'll give you real-time altitude readings accurate to 6 inches. This must have taken all night." "Yes, ma'am, but I had help." Beck gestured to the other side of the hangar, where 3 other maintenance crew members were working on Garrett's chase aircraft. "We figured if you're both going into that canyon, you both deserve every advantage we can give you." Garrett approached, inspecting Beck's work with the careful attention of someone who understood that maintenance excellence was the difference between life and death. He ran his hands over the modified control surfaces, examined the sensor installations, nodded approval. "Outstanding work, Airman. This might just keep her alive." He turned to Meredith. "We should get some rest. Wheels up at 0600. That gives us 3 hours." But neither of them slept. Meredith lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, running through attack approaches in her mind. Garrett sat in the squadron ready room, reading maintenance logs and weather forecasts, as if they might contain some secret that would make the mission less impossible. At 0500, they met on the flight line as the sun began painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. The A-10s waited like patient predators, fully armed and fueled, ready to carry their pilots into terrain that had already claimed too many lives. Garrett approached Meredith before they began pre-flight checks. In his hand was a small box, worn with age. "Your father asked me to give this to you when you became a pilot. I've been carrying it for 14 years, since I found out you'd joined the Air Force." He handed her the box. "He left it with me before that final mission. Said if anything happened, I should make sure you got it." Meredith opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a set of dog tags on a chain, marked with her father's name and service number, and underneath, a letter in handwriting she'd never seen but somehow recognized. "Read it after the mission," Garrett said quietly. "Read it when you come back alive, because that's what he would have wanted. Not for you to carry his words into combat, but to bring yourself home safely and then learn what he had to say." Meredith closed the box and slipped it into her flight suit pocket, next to her heart. "Let's go bring those operators home." They climbed into their respective aircraft as the sun cleared the mountains, painting the world in light that promised nothing about the darkness waiting in the valleys ahead. Meredith strapped into her cockpit, ran through the familiar pre-flight sequence, felt the twin engines come alive with their distinctive whine. Garrett's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. "Reaper 21, this is Reaper 22, pre-flight complete, ready when you are." "Reaper 22, Reaper 21, let's go to work." The 2 A-10s taxied to the runway in formation, their shadows long in the early morning light. And as they rotated into the sky, climbing toward the mountains where 8 Delta Force operators waited for rescue, and where Elias Calloway's ghost still flew the eternal canyon, Meredith felt the weight of her father's dog tags against her chest, and wondered if she was flying toward her destiny or away from it. The flight to Tora Bora took 43 minutes, across terrain that looked like the earth had been broken and never bothered to heal. Meredith flew lead with Garrett 500 feet above and behind, the 2 A-10s cutting through morning air that was clear enough to see forever and cold enough to make the engines work harder for every degree of thrust. The radio chatter was minimal and professional. Garrett called out navigation checkpoints. Meredith acknowledged. Master Sergeant Harding provided intelligence updates from Kandahar. Enemy forces were 12 minutes from the Delta operator's position, moving with the confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. At 30 minutes out, Garrett's voice came through with a different quality, less professional briefing and more personal history. Reaper 21, you're approaching the geographic area where your father went down. The valley system ahead contains 3 separate canyons. The westernmost is where he crashed. The center canyon is our target. They're connected by narrow passes that make navigation critical. Meredith checked her tactical display. The canyons appeared as dark scars cutting through mountains that rose over 12,000 feet. From altitude, they looked almost beautiful. Geological formations that spoke to millions of years of patient erosion. From inside those canyons, she knew, they would look like the walls of a tomb. Reaper 22 understood. Which canyon did you fly in 1998? A pause, then. All 3. That's how I know them. Your father and I made 5 separate missions into this valley system during operations against Taliban forces. We knew every turn, every thermal current, every place where the walls narrowed enough to make you question whether 31 feet of wingspan would fit through 35 feet of space. But he crashed on the 6th mission. He crashed because he got overconfident, because we'd flown it 5 times successfully and started thinking impossible had become routine. That's the trap, Captain. Survive impossible once and you start believing you're immortal. Survive it 5 times and you forget that physics doesn't care about your track record. The mountains were close now, their peaks catching sunlight while their valleys remained in shadow. Meredith could see the smoke column rising from the crash site, a thin black line that marked where 8 Delta operators were making their stand against overwhelming odds. Reaper 21, this is Grizzly 8 Actual. A new voice cut into the frequency, carrying the particular calm that came from accepting death and then being offered a chance to postpone it. We have your aircraft visual. Enemy forces are massing on the eastern ridge. Estimate 10 minutes before they're in position to overrun us. Grizzly 8, Reaper 21. Understood. Beginning approach now. Mark your perimeter with IR strobes and get everyone under hard cover. Roger, Reaper 21. We're trusting you with our lives. The words carried weight that went beyond radio protocol. 8 men she'd never met, whose names she didn't know, whose families were thousands of miles away hoping for phone calls that might never come. They were trusting her to fly through terrain that had killed her father, to accomplish what doctrine said was impossible, to thread a needle made of rock and violence at 300 knots. Meredith pushed the stick forward and dove toward the canyon entrance. The descent was controlled but aggressive, altitude unwinding faster than normal procedures would allow. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. The terrain rising to meet her like the earth was reaching up to reclaim what had been borrowed. Reaper 21, you're hot on approach. Garrett's voice carried an edge now, the professional calm starting to show cracks. Recommend slowing your descent rate. Negative, Reaper 22. The longer I take to reach attack position, the more time the enemy has to set up. Meredith's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, adjusting trim and throttle, preparing the aircraft for the violence of close air support in confined spaces. 2,000 feet, 1,000, 500. The canyon entrance appeared ahead, narrower than Hindu Kush, more constrained. Meredith's tactical display showed the dimensions. 46 feet wide at the entrance, narrowing to 44 feet within the first half mile, then constricting to 42 feet at the point where the Delta operators waited. The math was tighter than Hindu Kush. 8 feet of clearance total, 4 feet per wing, 48 inches. The width of a doorway at 300 knots. Reaper 21, I'm reading wind shear indicators at the canyon entrance. Garrett's voice was tight now. Recommend offset approach to minimize. I see it. Meredith adjusted her angle, coming in at 5 degrees off centerline to account for the crosswind that was funneling through the canyon mouth. Beck's proximity sensors began emitting soft tones, their pitch rising as the canyon walls closed in on either side. 100 feet above the valley floor. 75. 50. The world narrowed to the canyon walls and the space between them. Rock faces that had been weathered by millennia of wind and rain blurred past at speeds that made them seem liquid rather than solid. Meredith could see individual boulders, patches of scrub vegetation, the striations in the stone that told stories of ancient seas and continental drift. Reaper 21, you're at 40 feet altitude. Garrett's voice had gone flat, the tone of a man watching something he couldn't stop and didn't want to witness. Recommend climb to minimum safe. There is no minimum safe altitude in this canyon, Reaper 22. There's only the altitude that lets me engage targets. Meredith's eyes flicked between the windscreen and her targeting system. Enemy positions appeared as heat signatures on the eastern ridge, Taliban fighters who thought they were safely above any possible air threat. They were wrong. The GAU-8 cannon spun up, its 7 barrels already spinning to combat speed. Meredith squeezed the trigger, and the world became BERT, that distinctive sound that existed nowhere else in nature or war. The sound of 30-millimeter depleted uranium rounds leaving the gun at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The eastern ridge erupted in explosions of rock and flesh and equipment. Taliban fighters who'd been setting up crew-served weapons simply ceased to exist, replaced by expanding clouds of dust and debris. The cannon fire echoed off the canyon walls and multiplied, making it sound like a dozen aircraft were attacking instead of one. But the enemy adapted faster than Meredith expected. They'd learned from decades of fighting American air power. Return fire came from positions she hadn't spotted, green tracers that reached up from the western ridge in search for her aircraft with mathematical precision. Taking fire from multiple positions, Meredith banked hard right, the canyon wall rushing toward her wingtip with speed that made her proximity sensors scream a continuous warning tone. She compensated left, overcorrected, then found the center line again through pure instinct. Reaper 21, pull up. You're too low for evasive maneuvers. Garrett's voice had lost all pretense of calm. You're going to hit the wall. Reaper 22, maintain your altitude and provide target updates. I've got this. But even as she said it, Meredith felt the aircraft shudder as rounds impacted the armored fuselage. The titanium bathtub around the cockpit did its job, protecting her from small arms fire. But the hits were coming with increasing frequency. She pulled into a climb, the G-forces compressing her into the seat as the aircraft clawed for altitude. The canyon walls fell away, and she was above them, momentarily safe, circling back for a second approach. Reaper 21, damage assessment shows hits on your port side stabilizer and engine cowling. No critical systems affected, but you're accumulating damage. Garrett had moved his aircraft into a position above the canyon, high enough to avoid the concentrated fire, but close enough to provide overwatch. Recommend abort and let me make the next pass. Negative. Ground team has 8 minutes before enemy overrun. I need to suppress the western ridge positions. Meredith checked her weapons display. The cannon still had plenty of ammunition. Her AGM-65 Maverick missiles were ready for precision strikes. And somewhere deep in her chest, something that felt like her father's stubbornness refused to let her hand this mission to anyone else. She dove back into the canyon. The second run suppressed western positions, but didn't break the assault. She needed a third pass. The third pass came in even lower, 30 feet above the valley floor, so close that her jet wash kicked up dust clouds that obscured vision and made flying by instrument and faith equally necessary. Beck's sensors screamed continuously now, but Meredith had learned their language. High meant left wall, low meant right, steady meant centered in the killing corridor. The canyon narrowed, 44 feet, 43. Her targeting system locked onto the western ridge positions, and she triggered the Mavericks, watching them streak away on trails of white smoke to find targets that had been marked by the Delta operators below. Explosions rippled along the ridgeline, but the canyon was narrowing further, and Meredith realized with cold clarity that Garrett had been right about one thing. Her father had flown this canyon successfully 5 times because he'd learned its rhythms. She was flying it for the first time, discovering its secrets at 300 knots while people were trying to kill her. 42 feet wide, 6 feet of clearance on either side. The canyon bent 30 degrees to the left ahead, a turn that Meredith's tactical display had shown, but which looked far more severe from inside the valley. She banked hard, following the curve, and felt her starboard wingtip brush against something solid. Not a direct impact, just a kiss of metal against stone, so brief that it barely registered in the aircraft's handling. But Meredith knew, with the certainty that comes from 600 hours in the same aircraft type, that she just made contact with terrain while flying at combat speed. The same thing her father had done. The same thing that had started the cascade of failures that killed him. Reaper 21, I saw that. Garrett's voice was sharp with panic barely controlled. You hit the wall. Check your systems. Meredith's eyes swept the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure holding steady. Engine temperatures normal. Flight controls responsive. Beck's reinforcements were holding. The modifications had created margins her father never had. Systems are green, Reaper 22. Continuing attack run. Meredith, listen to me. Garrett had dropped all protocol, using her first name for the first time since they'd met. Your father hit the wall on his 4th pass. Systems showed green, but the impact had caused micro-fractures in the hydraulic lines. They failed 30 seconds later. Pull up now before... Grizzly 8 actual, this is Reaper 21. What's your status? The Delta team leader's response came between bursts of gunfire. Reaper 21, enemy forces are 200 meters from our perimeter. We need immediate fire support or they're going to overrun us in the next 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Not enough time to climb out, circle back, plan a safer approach. 3 minutes meant this pass or nothing. Success or watching 8 Delta operators die while she flew safe patterns at altitude. Meredith made the same choice her father had made. She pressed the attack. The canyon opened slightly ahead, widening to 48 feet, and Meredith used the extra room to maneuver for a better firing angle. The GAU-8 roared again, its shells chewing through enemy positions that had been advancing under cover. Taliban fighters fell or fled or simply disappeared in the kind of violence that reduces human beings to their component elements. But Garrett's warning echoed in her mind. Microfractures, hydraulic failure, 30 seconds. She checked her chronometer, 28 seconds since the wall impact. Flight controls still responsive. Pressure holding, 30 seconds. Nothing. 40 seconds. Still nothing. Meredith realized with a start that Beck's modifications had probably saved her. The reinforced control surfaces, the enhanced hydraulic lines, the improvements that an airman first class had installed without official authorization. The aircraft had been strengthened in exactly the places where her father's F-16 had failed. Reaper 22, systems remain green, completing attack run. She made one final pass, lower than before, 25 feet above the valley floor. Cannon fire walking across the remaining enemy positions with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Delta operators below had marked their perimeter with IR, strobes that showed in her targeting system as friendly symbols surrounded by hostile unknowns. Meredith flew the gap between them, putting fire danger close to American forces, trusting the Delta operators to stay down and trust her accuracy. The cannon shells impacted within 50 meters of friendly positions, well within the blast radius that Doctrine said was unacceptably dangerous. But Doctrine hadn't been written for canyons 42 feet wide. The enemy assault broke. Meredith could see it happening below as she flashed past. Taliban fighters retreating from positions they'd held moments before, running from the impossible aircraft that had appeared in a canyon where aircraft couldn't exist. Grizzly 8 actual, enemy assault is broken. You should have a window for extraction. Roger, Reaper 21. Ground extraction team is inbound. ETA 8 minutes. We're going to make it because of you. Meredith pulled into a climb, the canyon walls falling away as she gained altitude. Her aircraft was damaged but flying, systems strained but functional. She'd accomplished the mission. She'd saved 8 lives. She'd flown through the same canyon that killed her father and survived. But as she climbed through 5,000 feet, something in her hydraulic system finally gave up its fight against the damage it had sustained. Warning lights illuminated across her panel in a cascade of failures that spoke to systems pushed beyond their limits, and finally acknowledging defeat. Reaper 21, I'm showing total hydraulic failure. Meredith kept her voice calm through training and will in equal measure. Flight controls are unresponsive. Aircraft is not controllable. Eject! Garrett's voice was immediate and commanding. Eject now while you have altitude. But Meredith looked down at the valley below. The Delta operators were still exposed, still waiting for extraction. If she ejected, her aircraft would crash somewhere in that valley, potentially into the very position she just saved. An A-10 carried enough fuel and ordnance to create a crater that would kill anyone within 100 meters. She could see the path her father had faced, the same choice between ejecting safely and completing the mission. The same mathematics of personal survival versus mission success. And she understood, finally, what Garrett had been trying to teach her. Negative on ejection, Reaper 22. I'm taking the aircraft away from friendly positions before I punch out. Meredith, you don't have hydraulics. You can't control where it goes. I have throttle control and gravity. That's enough to aim. She pushed the throttles forward, pointing the nose toward a section of valley that showed as empty on her tactical display. The aircraft responded sluggishly, flying more like a guided missile than a maneuverable platform, but it was moving in the right direction. You're going to fly it as long as you can and eject at the last second, aren't you? Garrett's voice carried resignation and anger in something that might have been pride, just like your father. No. Meredith watched her altitude unwind. 4,000 feet, 3,000. Not like my father. He ejected too late and didn't survive. I'm going to eject with enough altitude to make it. But I'm not dropping this aircraft on friendlies. 2,000 feet. The valley floor rushing up to meet her with the inevitability of physics and poor decisions. I'm teaching those Delta operators the same lesson you taught me, Reaper 22. Smart beats brave. Survival beats heroic death. But survival doesn't mean abandoning people who are counting on you. 1,000 feet. It means finding the option that saves everyone, including yourself. 500 feet. Meredith pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew away with explosive force. The ejection seat fired, driving her up and out of the dying aircraft with acceleration that compressed her spine and made her vision go gray. The seat separated and the parachute deployed with a crack that she felt through her entire body. And then she was floating, suspended beneath a canopy of white nylon, watching her aircraft continue its ballistic trajectory into empty valley where it impacted with a fireball that sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and dust climbing toward the altitude she'd just abandoned. Garrett's aircraft appeared beside her, close enough that she could see him in the cockpit, see his face through the canopy. He gave her a thumbs up. She returned it. Reaper 21, your aircraft is destroyed, but you made it clear of the impact area. Ground extraction team is vectoring to your position. You'll be on a helicopter in 15 minutes. Roger, Reaper 22, thanks for the company. Meredith, Garrett's voice was soft now, the professional facade completely gone. Your father would be proud, not because you flew the canyon, but because you survived it. The parachute descent took 4 minutes that felt like hours. Meredith had time to feel the adrenaline start to leak away, time to recognize the trembling in her hands, time to understand how close she'd come to joining her father as a name on a memorial wall. The ground extraction team reached her moments after she landed. Delta operators who move with the efficiency of professionals who'd done this 1,000 times. They had her out of the parachute harness and on a helicopter within 6 minutes, reuniting her with the 8 men she'd saved from the canyon. Grizzly 8 Actual was a captain in his late 30s with the weathered look of someone who'd seen too many close calls to be surprised by anything. But when Meredith climbed aboard the helicopter, he extended his hand with something close to reverence. "Captain Calloway, you just did something I didn't think was possible. Thank you for our lives." Meredith shook his hand, feeling the weight of those words settle over her like a blanket. 8 men, 8 families who would get phone calls saying their loved ones were coming home. 8 futures that continued because she'd been willing to fly into terrain that shouldn't accommodate aircraft. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from Tora Bora toward Kandahar. Through the window, Meredith could see the canyon where her father had died, the valley where her aircraft had just crashed, the mountains that had claimed so many lives and almost claimed hers. She reached into her flight suit pocket and pulled out the box Garrett had given her. The dog tags on their chain, the letter in her father's handwriting. With hands that still trembled slightly, she unfolded the letter and began to read. The handwriting was neat and precise, the kind that came from military training and careful attention to detail. The date at the top was 1 day before her father's final mission. 26 years ago, when Meredith was 2 years old and her father was 28, and neither of them knew they had less than 24 hours left together. "My dearest Meredith," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I didn't come home. I'm sorry. I wanted to see you grow up. I wanted to teach you to ride a bike and help with homework and walk you down the aisle someday. I wanted to be your dad for all the years that matter, not just the first 2. Meredith's vision blurred, but she blinked the tears away and kept reading. "By now you've probably heard stories about how I died. They'll say I was a hero. They'll say I saved rangers who were pinned down in impossible terrain. They'll say I completed the mission even after my aircraft was damaged. All of that is true. But here's what they won't tell you. I could have survived if I'd been willing to do things differently. I could have ejected earlier. I could have asked for help. I could have flown smarter instead of trying to prove I was brave enough to handle anything alone. I made a choice in that canyon, baby girl. I chose the mission over coming home to you. And I'm writing this letter the night before that mission because I think I already know what's going to happen. I've flown this canyon 5 times successfully. I'm getting confident. I'm starting to think impossible is just another word for routine. Garrett tried to talk me out of tomorrow's mission. He said we should wait for better weather, better intelligence, better odds. I told him no. I told him the Rangers couldn't wait. But the truth is, I didn't want to wait because I was afraid of losing my nerve. That's the secret they don't teach you in flight school, Meredith. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid and flying anyway. But wisdom is knowing when being afraid means you shouldn't fly at all. If you become a pilot, and I hope you do because flying is in your blood, I want you to learn from my mistakes. I want you to be smarter than your old man. I want you to know that there's no shame in asking for help, in admitting you can't do something alone, in choosing survival over proving a point. The military will tell you I'm a hero. I am, but I'd rather be your father. I'd rather walk you to your first day of school and teach you to drive and meet your future husband and hold your kids someday. All the normal things that heroes give up when they choose glory over going home. Fly smart, baby girl. Fly safe. Fly with people you trust watching your back. And when you face that moment where you have to choose between being a hero and being alive, remember that the bravest thing isn't always charging forward. Sometimes the bravest thing is coming home. I love you more than flying, more than missions, more than anything in this world. If I don't come back tomorrow, know that my last thought was of you. Your father always, Elias Calloway. Meredith read the letter 3 times during the helicopter flight back to Kandahar. By the 3rd reading, the tears were flowing freely, and she didn't bother to hide them. The Delta operators around her respectfully looked away, giving her privacy in the crowded helicopter cabin. Her father hadn't wanted her to repeat his sacrifice. He'd wanted her to learn from it, to be smarter, not braver, to choose survival when the math allowed it, to ask for help instead of treating every mission like a personal test. And Meredith realized that's exactly what she'd done. She'd accepted Garrett's help. She'd used Beck's modifications. She'd ejected with enough altitude to survive instead of riding the aircraft all the way to impact. She'd honored her father not by dying like him, but by living smarter than him. Kandahar Air Base appeared ahead, its runways and buildings looking like civilization carved from desert. The helicopter touched down near the medical facility where Meredith would undergo mandatory post-ejection examination. As she climbed out, she saw Garrett's A-10 on final approach, the old colonel bringing his aircraft home with the smooth precision of someone who'd done it thousands of times. The medical examination was routine. Check for compression injuries from the ejection, verify mental status, ensure nothing had been damaged by the violence of leaving an aircraft at speed. The doctors cleared her within an hour, pronouncing her bruised but intact. She found Garrett in the squadron ready room, sitting with a cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking, staring at flight status boards that he wasn't reading. When she entered, he stood with the automatic courtesy of his generation in training. "Captain Calloway, I heard medical cleared you." "They did." Meredith pulled the letter from her pocket. "I read what my father wrote." Garrett nodded slowly. "I've been carrying that letter for 14 years, waiting for the right time to give it to you. After Hindu Kush, I thought maybe you weren't ready. After today, I know you are. Because I survived, because you learned, because you didn't try to do it alone, because when your hydraulics failed, you made the smart choice instead of the heroic one." Garrett's voice was rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Your father and I flew together for 3 years. He was the best pilot I ever knew. But he was too proud to ask for help when he needed it. You're better than that." Meredith sat down across from him. He knew he was going to die. The letter makes it clear. He flew that mission anyway. "He did, and I've spent 26 years wondering if I could have stopped him. If I'd tried harder, ordered him to stand down, physically prevented him from taking that mission." Garrett's hands gripped the coffee cup hard enough to make his knuckles white. "But I've learned something in those years. You can't stop people from making their own choices. You can only try to give them wisdom to make better ones." The letter helped, knowing what he really wanted from me. "Good, because there's something else you should know." Garrett pulled out his phone, scrolled to a photo, handed it to Meredith. The image showed a young woman, maybe 24 years old, with Meredith's eyes and their father's smile, standing in front of MIT's main building. "Who is this?" "Your half-sister, Amanda Calloway. Your father had another daughter from a relationship before he met your mother. He didn't know about Amanda until a few months before he died. Didn't have time to build much of a relationship with her before Tora Bora." Meredith stared at the photo, seeing her own features reflected in a stranger's face. "I have a sister?" "You have a sister who's been following your career, who watched you graduate from the academy, who was in the audience when you received your wings, who knows about you but wasn't sure if you'd want to know about her." Garrett took the phone back. "I'm telling you now because your father's letter talked about family, about the things he missed by dying. Amanda is 24 years old. She's an engineering student at MIT, and she's hoping that someday her big sister might want to meet her." The revelations kept coming, each one reframing Meredith's understanding of her father and her family, and her place in a story that was larger than she'd imagined. A sister she'd never known. A father who'd tried to learn from his mistakes, even if he couldn't survive them. A legacy that was more complicated than the simple narrative of heroic sacrifice. "I'd like to meet her. I'll set it up. After you've had time to process all this. After you've recovered from today." Garrett stood. "There's going to be a briefing tomorrow at 0900. JSOC wants to debrief the mission. The Air Force wants to discuss whether you'll face any consequences for losing an aircraft. And there are some Pentagon representatives who want to talk about establishing a new training program for canyon warfare tactics. Am I in trouble for the aircraft? No, not after 8 Delta operators gave statements about how you saved their lives. Not after I submitted my report as tactical advisor, stating that your decisions were sound under the circumstances. Not after Master Sergeant Harding pointed out that doctrine didn't cover the situation you faced, and you improvised successfully. Garrett smiled slightly. You're probably going to get a medal and a promotion, and they're going to ask you to help develop the training program that'll teach other pilots what you learned today. The briefing the next morning was everything Garrett had predicted and more. JSOC representatives praised the mission's success. Air Force leadership commended her tactical innovation. Pentagon officials outlined a vision for an advanced canyon warfare school that would train pilots in the kind of flying that saved lives when conventional approaches failed. And at the end of the briefing, Colonel Webb announced that Captain Meredith Calloway was being promoted to major and assigned as the primary instructor for the new program, with Colonel Garrett Brennan recalled to active duty as senior advisor. The formal ceremony happened 2 weeks later in a Pentagon briefing room filled with officers and officials and 8 Delta Force operators who'd flown from their forward operating base to attend. General Patricia Donovan, the Air Force Chief of Staff, pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Meredith's uniform while reading a citation that made the impossible sound almost routine. But the moment that mattered happened afterward, in a quiet corridor away from the ceremonies and speeches. In the days following the ceremony, Meredith found an unexpected visitor waiting outside her temporary Pentagon office. Lieutenant Wyatt Hollis stood at attention, his previous swagger completely absent. "Ma'am, I owe you more than an apology." His voice was steady but humble. "I question your abilities because I couldn't imagine anyone doing what you did. I was wrong, not just about you, about what it means to be a pilot." Meredith studied him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something harder won, respect earned through witnessing capability that exceeded his understanding. "Lieutenant, did you watch the mission telemetry?" "Every frame, ma'am, multiple times. I've requested assignment to the Canyon Warfare School. If you'll have me." He met her eyes. "I want to learn to fly like you do. Smart, not just brave." Meredith considered. Hollis had the flight hours, the technical knowledge. What he'd lacked was humility. That seemed to have arrived. "Report to Nellis in 3 weeks. And Lieutenant, the first thing we teach is when to say, you don't know something. You're ahead of the curve on that one." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." As he left, Meredith thought about her father's letter. Asking for help isn't weakness. Hollis was learning that lesson without having to die for it. That was progress. Later that day, Amanda Calloway was waiting in the same corridor, a young woman with their father's eyes, and a tentative smile that suggested hope mixed with uncertainty. "Hi," Amanda said. "I'm your sister." Meredith looked at this stranger who shared her blood and her father, and a legacy neither of them had chosen. "Hi, I'm sorry we're meeting for the first time at a medal ceremony." "Are you kidding? This is perfect. Our dad would be so proud." Amanda's smile grew more confident. "I heard you flew through a canyon that killed him and survived by being smarter than he was." "Someone gave me good advice at the right time." "Colonel Brennan told me he's been looking out for both of us, apparently, making sure we didn't make the same mistakes Dad did." Amanda pulled out her phone. "Can I show you something? I've been working on it since I heard about your mission." The phone screen showed engineering schematics for aircraft control systems, detailed technical drawings that spoke to advanced degrees and specialized knowledge. "I'm designing hydraulic redundancy systems for close air support aircraft, based on the failure modes that killed Dad and almost killed you. If I can make it work, pilots flying in restricted terrain will have backup systems that prevent catastrophic failures." Meredith looked at the schematics, understanding maybe half the technical details, but grasping the fundamental concept. Their father had died from hydraulic failure. Amanda was designing systems to prevent that death from happening to anyone else. Different skills, same mission. Honoring Elias Callaway by making the impossible a little less deadly. He'd be proud of you too, Meredith said. 6 months later, Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada became home to the Advanced Canyon Warfare School. The first class of 15 pilots assembled in a briefing room that still smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. They were a mix of experience levels and backgrounds, united only by the willingness to learn flying that existed at the edges of what aircraft and humans could survive. Major Meredith Callaway stood at the front of the room, wearing her uniform with the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the quiet confidence that came from surviving what should have killed her. Next to her stood Colonel Garrett Brennan, 72 years old and recalled to active duty for the specific purpose of teaching pilots how to fly smart instead of just brave. "Welcome to the Advanced Canyon Warfare School," Meredith began. "You're here because someone decided you have the skill and judgment to operate in terrain where conventional tactics don't work. But skill and judgment aren't enough. You need wisdom. You need to understand the difference between impossible and suicide." She clicked to the first slide, showing satellite imagery of the Hindu Kush and Tora Bora canyons. "My father died flying through a canyon in Tora Bora 26 years ago. He was an exceptional pilot, one of the best his generation produced. But he made a mistake that cost him everything. He thought courage meant flying alone, proving he could handle anything without help. I flew those same canyons. I survived because I learned from his mistake. I accepted help from Colonel Brennan. I used modifications that Airman Beck Donovan developed. I ejected when my aircraft failed instead of riding it to impact. I survived because I was smart, not because I was brave." Garrett stepped forward. "This school exists to teach you that wisdom. We'll train you in terrain-following techniques that predate GPS and radar. We'll teach you modern precision tactics that leverage technology. We'll show you how to read canyons like books, understanding their moods and dangers before you commit to the entrance. But most importantly," Meredith continued, "we'll teach you when to say no, when to abort, when to ask for help, when to recognize that surviving to fly another day is more valuable than proving you can do the impossible." Over the next 6 months, those 15 pilots learned to fly canyons in Nevada that approximated the terrain of Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen. They learned shadow reading and echo timing and acoustic altitude estimation. They learned terrain radar and proximity sensors and modern flight control systems. They learned from Garrett's 40 years of experience and Meredith's recent survival. And they learned the final lesson that Elias Callaway had tried to teach in his letter, that heroism isn't dying for the mission, it's living smart enough to complete many missions over a long career. On graduation day, the ceremony was attended by 8 Delta Force operators who'd been saved from Tora Bora, 12 Navy SEALs who'd been rescued from Hindu Kush, and a young MIT engineering student named Amanda Callaway, who designed hydraulic systems that were being installed in the next generation of close air support aircraft. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Donovan stood among the honor guests, wearing her dress uniform with the Air Force Commendation Medal she'd received for technical innovations that directly contributed to mission success and pilot survival. The citation hadn't mentioned the unauthorized modifications, the 18-hour shifts, or the willingness to risk court-martial. But Meredith knew, Garrett knew, and the 15 graduating pilots knew, because Beck's proximity sensors and reinforced hydraulics were now being installed as standard equipment in every A-10 assigned to canyon warfare operations. Beck caught Meredith's eye across the ceremony and nodded once. No words needed. They both understood the invisible web that connected maintainer and pilot, the trust that turned metal and regulations into survival. Meredith nodded back. "Thank you for keeping me alive." The message crossed the distance without speaking. Beck's slight smile said, "Thank you for making my brother's pilot come home." That was the deal. That was always the deal. Meredith stood with Garrett watching the new pilots receive their canyon warfare qualifications. 15 more pilots who could operate in impossible terrain. 15 more who'd been taught to value survival as much as success. Your father would be proud, Garrett said quietly, not just of what you've accomplished, of who you've become. Meredith touched the dog tags she wore under her uniform, the ones that had belonged to Elias Callaway, and now served as a reminder of lessons learned through loss. I hope so. I hope he knows we're teaching pilots to be smarter than he was. He knows. Somehow, somewhere, he knows. Garrett smiled. And he's probably annoyed that it took dying for him to get the point across. That evening, after the ceremonies and celebrations had ended, Meredith found herself alone in her office looking at photographs that documented her journey. Her father in his flight suit, Garrett standing next to an F-16, Amanda holding her MIT diploma, Beck Donovan in her staff sergeant uniform, the first class of Canyon Warfare graduates, and on her desk, a framed copy of her father's letter, the words she read every morning before flying. Fly smart, baby girl. Fly safe. Fly with people you trust watching your back. And when you face that moment where you have to choose between being a hero and being alive, remember that the bravest thing isn't always charging forward. Sometimes the bravest thing is coming home. Her phone buzzed with a text from JSOC. Another mission. Operators trapped in Yemen, canyon 40 feet wide, requesting Major Callaway and Colonel Brennan. Meredith looked at the request, then at her father's letter, then at the photo of Amanda, who designed the hydraulic systems that made the mission survivable. She typed her response. Accepted. Brennan and I will fly together. Mission planning begins tomorrow at 0600. Not flying alone, not proving anything, just doing the job with the wisdom to do it right and the humility to ask for help when needed. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line where two A-10s sat ready for whatever came next. The aircraft that had carried her through impossible canyons, the machines that had been strengthened by Beck's innovations and flown with Garrett's wisdom and survived through Meredith's willingness to learn from her father's death instead of repeating it. Meredith touched her father's dog tags one more time, feeling the worn metal that had survived a crash 26 years ago. 3 generations now, her father's sacrifice, her survival, Amanda's innovations, and 15 newly trained pilots who would carry the lessons forward. She thought about the girl who joined the Air Force to understand a father she never knew. That girl had been chasing a ghost, trying to prove herself worthy of a legacy built on heroic death. But the woman who stood here now understood something deeper. Her father's real legacy wasn't dying bravely. It was the letter that asked her to live wisely. It was Garrett's 40 years of experience freely shared. It was Beck's modifications born from loyalty and skill. It was Amanda's engineering genius preventing future failures. It was 8 Delta operators and 12 SEALs going home to families because impossible didn't mean inevitable. The legacy was choosing to come home. Meredith grabbed her flight jacket and headed for the door. There was mission planning to do, lives to save, and a promise to keep. That Elias Callaway's daughter would fly smarter than her old man, and in doing so, honor him better than any heroic death ever could. The mountains were waiting. The canyons were there. The impossible missions would keep coming. But now there were pilots trained to face them with skill and wisdom and the hard-won knowledge that coming home alive was the greatest victory of all. And Meredith Callaway, daughter, sister, pilot, teacher, was ready to lead them there.